techniques that can be approached, and life will be a lot more interesting if there's diversity in outcomes.
How come we live in an open society with a lot of information and yet we know so little?
I understand.
Sorry. How come we live in an open society with a lot of information, yet we know so little?
Actually, I add a little personal touch. About 25 years ago, I was asked by a publisher to write a book. Finally came out with a different publisher called Knowledge of Language. The reason it came out with a different publisher was because I included in the book one chapter that the original publisher refused to publish. It was in part about this question. Most of the book was about what I called Plato's problem, the problem of how we know so much with so little information. The last chapter was about something I called Orwell's problem, this one. How come we know so little with so much information? So those are the last, and then I went on and gave the reasons. It's not very profound. The publisher wasn't going to allow that, so we got to know little. But the answer is straightforward. It's the kind of thing I was talking about. I mean, there are concerted efforts to make sure that you know very little and understand very little, which is even more important, even with so much information about. So when you go to school, you don't read about the first 9/11. You don't read about Reagan's war on terror. You do read about Solzhenitsyn and Havel and others, and about our courage in supporting them, but you don't read about the Jesuit intellectuals, or the war against the church, or the effort to destroy the attempt to bring back the Christianity of the Gospels. I mean, those are things you just don't read about. They're there. You can find them. We live in open societies. You can go to the library. You can get the information about them. But it's a research project, and that's conscious. Partly it's internalized by educated people. You're kind of brought up that way yourself, so that's the way you see things, and it's more convenient, and so on. And if you break out of the mold, there are difficulties. In our societies like ours, the difficulties aren't very severe, but they're there. And it's easier not to face difficulties. It's easier to come to believe what it's convenient to believe. So these various factors, some quite conscious, others just sort of normal human reactions, lead to a situation in which there's tons of information out there, but you don't know it. Or if you know it, you don't understand it.
Several people are asking you to express your opinion on WikiLeaks.
Well, the WikiLeaks, I'm often asked, do I think Julian Assange was a hero or a devil? I don't think either. I think it's just a person doing his civic responsibility. It's a civic responsibility to help people know and understand what power systems are up to. They don't like it, of course, no matter what power system it is. They'd rather have their workings be secret from the public. But what right do they have to keep their workings secret from the public? Technically, they're supposed to be our representatives. We should know everything they're doing. You can imagine there might be some cases in which information has to be kept, in which there's an argument for keeping information secret. But you have to make the argument. The burden of proof is always on a power system that says this has to be secret. Maybe sometimes they can meet it. So, for example, take the Pentagon Papers, which were a very rich store of information. Dan Ellsberg, who released them, did keep one volume. He did not. There was one volume he didn't give to the press. I was one of the people who distributed the papers. A couple of the friends of his. So we had the volume. I was able to read it, but we didn't give it to the press. I wasn't convinced that was necessary, but made some sense. The volume was about negotiations, and there were ongoing negotiations. So if you took the negotiation seriously, and frankly I didn't, then it would have, there's an argument for not releasing it. It might disrupt the negotiations. But an argument has to be given. And it's very rare that that burden can be met. It's kind of like the burden that has to be met by any authoritarian or hierarchic institution. It has to justify itself. It's not self-justifying. You take a look at the WikiLeaks. I think I can't think of anything there that there would be any argument to have suppressed. And there's a lot of interesting material, very interesting. Maybe the most interesting material, at least to me, is what it tells us, what the WikiLeaks tell us, not about governments, but about our own intellectual communities, the communities that we live in, the educated sectors, the cultural elite, if you like, the press, and so on. And what it revealed is extremely interesting. And it's even more interesting that it hasn't been noticed. It's pretty transparent. I suppose the Dutch press was much like the English language press. In the English language press, what it got the most attention, big headlines and everything, was that the Arabs support us on Iran, crucial issue. And a lot of excitement, this shows how we're doing the right thing. Even the Arabs support us, strongly support us. Well, take a look at what came out in WikiLeaks about that. What came out was statements by Arab dictators. They allegedly support us. But what about the Arab population? Actually, there's a lot known about Arab public opinion. It's not reported, at least in English. Maybe it was reported here. I doubt it. But a lot is known about Arab public opinion. There are recent polls taken by the most prestigious U.S. polling organizations released by major institutions, Brookings Institute in Washington, others. And what they say is quite interesting. For example, in Egypt, 90% of the public think their worst enemy is the United States. The figures are pretty similar for the whole region, the United States and Israel, which are regarded correctly as about the same thing. So, on the order of 80 to 90% throughout the region say that's the main threat. What about Iran? 10% think Iran is a threat. In fact, support for Iran, or rather hatred for Western policy, is so extreme that a large majority think that the region would be better off if Iran had nuclear weapons. In Egypt, 80%. Well, the Arabs support us. Yeah, the Arab dictators. What matters to the editorial writers and the commentators and the public intellectuals and so on is that the dictators support us. If the population strongly opposes us, who cares? As long as they're quiet, as long as you can keep them under control, who cares? Now that reveals an attitude towards democracy which is extremely significant. It indicates pretty strikingly the extent to which democracy is absolutely hated by educated sectors that have any connection to power or privilege. And it's very relevant to, incidentally, this is not the first time this has been true. This has been true for decades, and there's plenty of evidence about it. But again, it's not what you're likely to be taught in school or read in the newspapers and so on. But you can find it out. And you've learned something about yourselves. That's really important. Knowing yourself is quite important. That's why that bad guy drank the hemlock. Thanks.
What is the role of intellectual critique in a society like Holland, where critique and not positive policy making is the standard?
Where?
What is the role of intellectual critique in a society?
Critique and not positive. Well,
there's a continuation.
I see.
Should intellectuals take on a more positive role in making neat plans that can be implemented in practice instead of a critical approach?
Well, taking the last part, I don't see why there's a distinction. Taking a critical approach just in order to criticize is, maybe makes you feel good, but no point. Taking a critical approach because you want to see policy changes, yeah, that makes good sense. So go back to, say, the prophets. When they were giving a critical analysis of the deeds of the evil kings, they were calling for a change in policies and attitudes. And that's what critical people ought to be doing, critical intellectuals, if you like. What was the first point?
What is the role of an intellectual critique in a society where critique is the standard?
Yeah, change the society. It doesn't work like that. Yeah.
You get some.
Yeah, thanks.
You said, don't speak truth to powers, they'll know it already. How do you explain they don't act on this truth?
Don't speak truth to power. Oh, they do. I mean, how the powerful... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
What you argue for is reasonable, very reasonable to any human being. How come people in power don't act on it? Are they all corrupted by power, immoral, perhaps amoral?
Well, they may be whatever they are. That's, for their families and psychiatrists to worry about. But they're in institutions. When you're an institution and you play a role in that institution, there's some limits on what you can do. So let's take a couple of, I think concrete examples are good to think about instead of abstract discussion. We're in the middle of a huge fiscal crisis, economic crisis. Where did that come from? Well, to a large extent, it came from a basic principle of market systems, which is an unavoidable property of market systems. Namely, if you're, suppose you sell a car to somebody. If you're paying attention, you carry out that transaction so that you make out reasonably well, and the other person does too. But there's some things you don't consider. Like you don't consider the effect on her, say. That's called an externality if you've studied economic theory. The effect of a transaction on others is something you don't consider in market systems, right? And there is an effect. Like if you buy a car, there's more pollution, there's more congestion, a lot of things that affect other people. But those are externalities. You don't care about them. Well, in financial systems, there's a big externality, which is well understood. It's called systemic risk. Systemic risk is the risk that the whole system will crash. Okay, so if, say, Goldman Sachs makes a transaction which they will, if they're doing their job, they'll cover the risk to themselves, right? They'll take that into account. They won't take into account the risk that the whole system will crash. That's an externality. Well, that externality happens to have big effects, like crashing the system repeatedly. Ever since during the 50s and the 60s, there weren't any financial crashes because there were regulations in place. In the 70s on to the 80s and 90s, the regulatory apparatus has been dismantled. As a result, systemic risk is always ever present, and you have repeated financial crises. Well, these financial crises, these are pretty bad crises. And the financial crisis leads to a general economic crisis. So people don't have jobs. In the United States now, probably 20% of the population qualifies for food stamps because they just can't get food. This is pretty serious. But for the rich and the powerful, it doesn't matter because they don't really, this comes back to talking truth to power. They may preach market systems, but they don't believe in them. What they believe in is a powerful nanny state that works for them, not for anyone else, but it works for them. So if the system crashes, say Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan Chase and Barclay Banks and the rest of them, if they crash the system as they just did, they have a solution. Run to the nanny state, holding your copy of Hayek and so on, and tell them to bail you out, meaning the taxpayer to bail you out, which is what happens. That's a government insurance policy. It's called too big to fail. It means if you crash the system, you just come and say, look, I'm too big to fail, bail me out. And the taxpayer dutifully bails them out. Right now, they're richer than ever. If you following what's happening in the United States. There are huge protests all over the country, in Wisconsin and elsewhere, and people are in real trouble. At the same moment, they're cutting back collective bargaining, pensions, they want to cut Social Security, everything's got to be cut, like here. Meanwhile, at the very same moment, the people who caused the crisis are giving themselves fabulous bonuses. Goldman Sachs just quietly, and they're the worst of them, announced $17.5 billion in bonuses for management, $12.5 million just for the CEO, triple his salary, and so on. That's happening right at the moment when there's real suffering around the country. The same, I just happen to be in England. There's a front page story every day about the bankers who gave themselves a massive bonus. Probably the same is happening here. So that's an externality. You don't pay attention to it. Now let's go back to the CEO of Goldman Sachs. Is he a bad person? No, I don't know I don't care one way or another whether he's a good person or a bad person. Like I say, that's a problem for his family. But the role that he plays forces this decision, literally. If he decides, I'm not going to make that decision, he's out and somebody else is in who will make it. Because that's a property of the semi-market system that he's participating in. Now, in that case, there's somebody around to bail you out when everything crashes. But there's another case, quite a critical one, in fact, a lethal one, where externalities are ignored and necessarily ignored, and it'll probably destroy the species. That's the environmental crisis. The business world does not want to do anything to deal with the environmental crisis for good reasons. It harms their short-term profit. Now, suppose you're the CEO, chairman of some corporation in the United States. Your task is to maximize short-term profit and market share, period. If you don't do that, you're out and somebody else is in. In fact, in Anglo-American law, it's a legal requirement. But quite apart from that, you just have to do it or you're just not in that position anymore. It's a crime of the position, not of the individual. That means you've got to ignore externalities. In this case, the externality is the fate of the species. It means you have to try to convince people, you have to run big propaganda campaigns to convince people that global warming is a liberal hoax and so on, which is exactly what's being done. It's quite effective. I don't know what it is here, but in the United States, maybe about a third of the population thinks it's a serious problem at this point. And you take a look at the new Republican Congress, just about everyone who came in as a climate denier. It's all a liberal hoax. We don't want to do anything. They're already cutting down funding, not only for U.S. programs, but even for the International Scientists Organization, been defunded. They don't want to do anything about it because the fate of the species is an externality. And if you're working in a market system, you don't pay attention to it. Well, in this case, there's no taxpayer to bail you out. Once you destroy the possibilities of decent human survival, kiss each other goodbye. And that's where we are right now. This is not an abstract consideration. It's happening right before our eyes, right before our eyes. Now, those are serious problems, and it doesn't make sense to ask, is that person good or bad? There's an institutional structure which is lethal, harmful in the case of, say, financial institutions, but not lethal. Lethal in this case, and that's not the only one.
Can there be a society without organized violence? For instance, wars, civil war, dictatorship. What do you think the ideal world would look like?
Well, that was actually a question raised by two great 20th century figures, Bertrand Russell and Albert Einstein. They came out in 1955 with a memorandum, kind of a statement to the people of the world, a declaration to the people of the world. It was about nuclear war. That's another case like global warming. It could be and probably will be the destruction of the species. their declaration told, I forget the exact words, but it was exactly this. They said to the people of the world, you're facing a choice that is stark and unavoidable. Either mankind will abandon war or the species is finished. That's their conclusion, and I think it's plausible. There just can't be any more major wars. I mean, look, take, say, Europe. Europe for centuries was the most savage, brutal place in the world. The Europeans spent most of their time in creative energy and activity and figuring out ways to slaughter each other. That went on for centuries. Europe, in fact, created a technology and a culture of savagery and barbarism which is so extreme that they could conquer the rest of the world. I mean, if you look at the conflicts between Europe and India, Mexico, and so on, Europe always conquered the enemy, but by savagery. In fact, you read military historians. What they say is that for most of the world, war was a kind of a sport. For Europe, it was a science, and it won. So small groups of Europeans could massacre huge numbers of what they called barbarians, people who didn't think that war was a science. Well, that's the core part of European history up to 1945. Not since. Did genes change? No change in the genes. What happened is that Europeans finally realized that the next time they play their favorite game of slaughtering each other, it's all going to be over. You can't do it anymore. The level of savagery and violence has reached a point where you just can't make use of it. So something has to be done to cut it back. So yeah, that's an answer. It's not necessary in human nature. I mean, unless these forces are constrained, they'll blow up. But they can be constrained. So the chances of a major war inside Europe are very slight, which is a huge change from centuries of history.
Mr. Chomsky says that we should address the right audience, but he also says that people in power try to make dissidents be ignored in the least. In the light of this, what would be the most practical or efficient way to go about addressing the audience and trying to be heard by them?
That depends where you are. If you were, say, in El Salvador, there wasn't really an answer to that, because you're going to get your brains blown out, which is what happened. If you're in, say, Turkey, which is a moderately repressive society, pretty free, but not entirely, probably what they're doing is the best way. Constant protest, civil disobedience, and so on. I mean, I've been in Turkey a number of times over the past 10 years and have actually participated in some of these civil disobedience actions. I was there a couple months ago, and there was a major conference on freedom of speech, and the participants, mostly Turkish, were journalists, artists, academics, and others, describing the activities that they're involved in, which are very courageous. A lot of them are working on Armenian rights and trying to bring about the recognition of the Armenian genocide and the repression of Armenian sins. And most of them are working on Kurdish rights. That's the big issue, and it was extremely brutal in the 1990s. It's been improving some since, but still going on. Well, that's the best method for them, facing real problems. The best method for people like us is much easier. We have very limited constraints. I mean, enough freedom has been won in societies like ours, so that it's not perfect, and you're not going to get lauded, but there's a wide range of opportunity to do all kinds of things without suffering the kinds of severe penalties that only saints are willing to endure.
possible to be well-intentioned while committing atrocities? If so, should these good intentions change our assessment of these atrocities?
I think it's not only possible to be well-intentioned, at least by self-perception, while committing atrocities, but it's almost universal. You just take a look at the record of major criminals. You know, I mean, I'm talking about people like Hitler and Stalin and the rest of them. Not just sort of garden variety atrocities, but I mean, world-shaking ones. You take a look at the record, it's being done with the utmost nobility. I mean, Hitler invaded Poland to protect Germany from what he called the wild terror of the Poles. The Germans had no choice. You know, the Poles were terrorizing them. They had to defend themselves. Slaughtering the Jews was saving the purity of civilization. Hitler didn't talk about it much, but people like Martin Heidegger did. I remember, I was kind of surprised when, in recent years, there was kind of discussion of the discovery that Heidegger had been a Nazi. I mean, I started reading him in the 1950s. Take a look at Introduction to Metaphysics. You know, you get in 20 pages. He's talking about how it's the task of Germany to save civilization, which comes from the Greeks to the Teutons. The Germans are the inheritors, and they have to protect it from the barbarians of the East and West. You know? And corrupt elements have to be eliminated, and so on. So what can be more noble than preserving the civilization handed to us, to the Greeks? Okay, that's the Nazis. You read the a lot of Russian archives have come out in the last since 1990, and they're pretty interesting reading. I mean, you take a look at the internal discussions. You know, Gromyko talking to Molotov and all this business, talking to each other, not trying to impress anyone. Now, they're talking about the need to defend democracy, people's democracies, from Western fascists. That's why you had to prevent anything from happening in Eastern Europe. You know, again, perfectly noble. And in fact, it's very rare to find anyone who says, I'm carrying out terrible crimes because I want to. You know, maybe there are people like that, but I think almost always you find a way to justify it. And I suspect if you look at your own experiences, you'll find plenty of things like that. Like maybe when you were 6 years old and your mother wasn't looking, you took a toy from your younger brother or something, and he went and ran and complained to your mother, and she came to see what's going on, and you said, I didn't do anything. He gave it to me. He didn't want it. It was mine anyway, and so on and so forth. You find a way to justify what you're doing, and you believe it. You really believe it. You convince yourself of it. And I think that's probably true quite generally. I think, not nice maybe, but I think it's probably true.
I'm going to commit a well-justified, abominable atrocity and conclude this discussion.
Yeah.
I would like to thank you, Noam Chomsky, for coming here, for giving your lecture, for telling us about your intellectual life, for giving us an example of how an academic, how an intellectual could act in this strange but nevertheless very beautiful society. Let me remind you of one fact before I close down, we go to coffee. The building we are in is an Armenian church, not an Armenian, but an Armenian church, which means it is the church for a branch of Dutch Reformed people who are tolerant in every way. And I think that's a very appropriate place to have you had your speech here. I wish you a very good stay here in Utrecht and hope to meet you soon.